Good evening and welcome. I'm Susan Galassi, Senior Curator at the Frick, and I want to thank you for making the effort to come out this evening. I know many more of you are listening in. This lecture is being live streamed, so I want to welcome those listeners as well. You've come to the right place on this stormy evening. The heat and the radiance of Vincent van Gogh's portrait of a peasant brings us a welcome slice of the Midi at the peak of summer. And here to transport us fully into that environment is one of the leading scholars of Van Gogh, Professor Judy Sund. But before I turn to our speaker, I'd like to say a few words about this installation. Van Gogh's portrait will remain on view at the Frick as a special loan until January 20th. The work is part of an ongoing exchange program with the Norton Simon Museum in Pasadena, which was initiated in 2008 by Colin Bailey, the Frick's chief curator, and Carol Tonieri, his counterpart at the Norton Simon. Since then, a number of paintings have traveled across the country for 3-month stays on the opposite coast. This portrait was selected by the two curators for both its importance and Van Gogh's work, and because it's not left the West Coast for nearly 40 years, and is one of his key works, painted at a time of transition. It's a revelation to many of us. We're privileged to have Judy Sund inaugurate this presentation. Dr. Sund earned her doctoral degree in art history as a student of Professor Theodore Reff at Columbia University. An undergraduate major in French language and literature, she brought an interdisciplinary approach to the study of Van Gogh, focusing on the artist's deep and largely overlooked roots in contemporary French novels, particularly those of Zola, Maupassant, and Daudet. Her groundbreaking book, True to Temperament, Van Gogh and the French Nationalist Literature, published in 1992, is now a classic in the field. In her next book, a monograph on Van Gogh, published by Ph.D. in 2002, she expanded her exploration of his sources to music and earlier art, and drew extensively from the artist's legendary correspondence with his brother to elucidate his creative process. Professor Sund continues to delve into many other aspects of Van Gogh's oeuvre in her essays for museum catalogs and for scholarly journals. While best known for her work on Van Gogh, she specializes as well in pre-Columbian art, on which she has also published widely. Recently, she's been drawn in yet another direction, to French 18th century art, in particular the work of Watteau. I think Van Gogh would approve of these lapses in her attention to him. Professor Sund is a longtime and much beloved faculty member of Queens College and the program of art history at the Graduate Center of the City University of New York. I wanted to mention that the gallery will remain open for a half hour after the lecture. I hope that by that time, Colin Bailey, who is delayed in his flight from Paris, will join us. But in the meantime, let's give a warm welcome to Professor Judy Sund.
Thank you, Susan. Thank you all for being here. And thanks especially to Van Gogh for painting such a great picture that people would come through a blizzard to hear me talk about it. This striking figure piece by Van Gogh, with its scintillating hues and extravagant textures, was painted in the summer of 1888 at Arles in the south of France. The vivid hues of the man's face and costume call up the season and region in which it was made, and the riotously impastoed blue and white backdrop suggests a wind-churned sky. In the literature on Van Gogh, this painting goes by two names. First, the title Van Gogh gave it, The Old Peasant, and parenthetically, the name of the man who posed it, Patience Escalier. This double-barreled title is worth noting up front since it draws attention to the picture's dual nature. Because it is a close-up frontal view and we know the model's name, art historians have been inclined to see it as a portrait. That is, a picture that conveys the physical appearance of a specific individual. But as Van Gogh's own comments make clear, it was conceived as something grander than that, and meant to visually encapsulate the essence of peasantness as Van Gogh understood it. As select passages from his voluminous letters make clear, this picture was shaped as much by the artist's preconceived notion of agrarian workers as it was by the physical presence of one Patience Escalier. The Old Peasant was one of several figural paintings Van Gogh made at Arles to celebrate characteristic Provençal types, from Arlesian beauty and zouave soldier to priest, poet, and cradle rocker. In casting select individuals as embodiments of whole categories of people and substituting categorical labels for their proper names, Van Gogh hoped, in his words, to present the image of a whole society by way of a series of exemplary specimens. He also hoped to rethink and revitalize the genre of portraiture, which late 19th century aesthetes often disdained because, as one of them, Théodore Doré, put it, portraiture's dominance constituted the triumph of bourgeois art. Since conventional portraits like this one are primarily personal documents that record individual appearance, status, and temperament, they were held by many to lack broad-based appeal. Van Gogh believed he could take portraiture in a new direction and make it, quote, comprehensible to the general public by using both exaggeration and simplification to point up the stereotypic qualities that connoted familiar types. Patience Escalier was one of many Arlesians who, having caught Van Gogh's eye, were pursued by him as models and eventually paid by him to sit for him. Yes, that's right. Unlike most portraitists, who are themselves approached and paid by people who wish to be painted, Van Gogh, in an inversion of that practice, chose and paid the people he wished to paint. In part, that approach stemmed from the fact that few people wanted the sorts of pictures Van Gogh produced, as he himself observed in a letter to his brother Theo. The poor little souls are afraid of being compromised and think people will laugh at their portraits. But Van Gogh's practice also was shaped by his own desire to pick and choose, to paint those people he found most representative of the Provençal society he observed at Arles. Having paid his chosen models, he felt absolved of the portraitist's usual obligation to achieve pleasing likeness. Instead, Van Gogh was able to modify, as he saw fit, privileged generalization over personal particulars, and, as he did here, to turn a single prime specimen into the embodiment of a broad sector of society. By the time he made this picture, Van Gogh's approach to figure painting was so firmly ingrained that the artist was taken aback when the first old man he approached to model for the old peasant asked to keep the picture his sitting would produce. As Van Gogh reported in a letter to Theo, "I wanted to paint a poor old peasant whose features were very coarse, almost to the point of caricature. I would have been very happy to paint him as the poor peasant he is, but he said he wanted to have a picture for himself, so that I would have had to make two, one for him and one for myself. I said no." The fact that the model wanted a picture was a deal breaker for Van Gogh, and the painter's refusal to yield this point was a deal breaker for that model, who never returned. Within a few days, however, Van Gogh had found another candidate for the old peasant, the man you see here. Patience Escalier was a one-time ranch hand who had herded livestock across the broad plains of the Camargue, a region to the south of Arles that is well known for its wild horses, pink flamingos, and monster mosquitoes. But by the time Van Gogh met him, Escalier had left his cowboy's life behind and was tending to the garden of a large farmstead outside Arles. Though he was not a peasant in the agrarian laborer sense of that word, he was a lifelong rustic who looked the part. In a letter to an artist friend, Van Gogh pronounced Escalier the genuine article, noting, "Now you know what a real peasant is and how much he resembles a wild beast when you've found one of the true race." The bestiality of the laboring class was a long-standing conceit among cultivated Europeans. This 17th century print of a peasant squatting to urinate, for instance, presents the man as a doggish creature at one with the land. And just a few years later, in 1688, French essayist Jean de la Bruyère took a similar tack in Les Caractères, a compendium of societal types. Bruyère there described the peasant as, quote, a wild animal who dined on roots and would just as soon occupy a cave as build himself a proper home. Van Gogh considered himself a connoisseur of such folks, in part because he had read La Bruyère and others, but mainly because he had grown up in a rural community. Like many of the 19th century artists who made a specialty of peasant pictures, Van Gogh could point to a country upbringing. But again, like most of his peasant painting colleagues, Van Gogh was no peasant. His father, Theodorus, was a university-educated clergyman who met Vincent's mother at The Hague, the cultural capital of 19th century Holland. Throughout their married life, however, Theodorus ministered to congregations in the North Brabant, the farming district in the southern Netherlands where Vincent van Gogh was born. The parsonage in which Vincent grew up was an island of culture in a sea of rusticity. The Van Goghs were a bookish and art-loving clan. Indeed, 3 of the Reverend Van Gogh's brothers were art dealers in urban centers, as Vincent and his brother Theo would grow up to be. While the majority of their Brabant neighbors were Catholic laborers, the Van Goghs were middle-class Protestants who kept their distance from the working class. Vincent's mother, fearful of the coarsening influence of local boys, had her own boys homeschooled until they could be packed off to boarding school. Still, Vincent would always claim an affection for rural life and an insider's knowledge of agrarian workers, even though peasants, as he put it, are, quote, a world apart from us civilized people, for what do they know about art and many other things? As an art lover with a fondness for rusticity, the teenage Van Gogh became a great aficionado of the Barbizon School while working as an art dealer in The Hague. The Barbizon School, founded in France around 1830, was so called because its members painted in the woodlands of the Barbizon forest southeast of Paris. Most of them specialized in landscapes like these, but the Barbizon artist Van Gogh most admired was a figural painter, Jean-François Millet. Millet's career had taken off around 1848, a year in which workers' uprisings across Europe challenged the prevailing social order. His reputation in the early years was built on portrayals of country life in all its harshness, and his notorious sewer, shown at the Salon of 1850, was viewed by many as a volley in a simmering class war. Even as Millet became a fixture at French salons in the 1860s, pictures like this one continued to rankle, centered upon a farmer almost broken by seemingly fruitless labor. His man with a hoe rudely contradicted urbanites' cherished assumptions about the boundless fecundity of French farmland and the simple pleasures of pastoral life. Unlike the playful, beribboned shepherdesses and farmhands who had cavorted across 18th century canvases, the hoer and the sower were lumpen and brutish, their bodies and faces marked by deprivation and exhaustion, and, some suspected, the sort of angry dissatisfaction that led to revolt. The muddy palettes and caked surfaces of Millet's paintings reflected the muckiness of his subjects' lives, leading Millet's contemporary, Théophile Gautier, to remark that the sower seems to be made of the earth he works. By the time Van Gogh encountered Millet, the artist had mellowed and won official honors, his pictures widely collected and reproduced. And when Van Gogh, having renounced the art trade, decided to make pictures instead of selling them, he looked to Millet's work for guidance. Living at that time in the isolation of a Belgian mine town, far from other artists, Van Gogh made Millet a mentor in absentia by studiously copying prints after his paintings. In the process, Van Gogh became especially attached to the sower. "I have already drawn the sower 5 times," he wrote, "and I am so completely absorbed in that figure that I shall take it up again." This prediction was borne out in his practice. Some 8 years later, Van Gogh would return to the sower in paintings made at Arles, and the last of his multiple takes on Millet's striding seed caster was made just weeks before Van Gogh's death. After the lonely, self-directed tutorial in draftsmanship, Van Gogh was anxious to re-enter what he called the land of pictures. The land of pictures was his catch-all phrase for the galleries, museums, and artist circles of European capitals. And, drawn to its arts community, Van Gogh moved to The Hague at the end of 1881. It was there that he took up oil for the first time and continued to hone his drawing skills, using live models rather than prints. He had virtually no success in selling his work, and despite an allowance from Theo, Vincent had a hard time making ends meet. After 2 years in the city, the 30-year-old artist bit the bullet and, like so many of today's postgraduates, moved back in with mom and dad, who were then living in the Brabant village of Noonan. There, despite ongoing tensions with his parents, Van Gogh happily returned to rustic subject matter, making several drawings and paintings of field laborers in the summer and spring of 1884. As the harvest wound down and these same workers hunkered down in their huts for winter, Van Gogh managed to cajole several of them into posing for him for a fee. Throughout the colder months, Vincent spent most days and evenings in workers' cottages that he himself described as squalid and smoke-blackened, making dozens of paintings and drawings, and focusing in particular on laborers' faces. Portrait-like in format, each of these bust-length close-ups references a particular set of features, but none of them bears its model's name. The subjects, moreover, don't present themselves in the manner of those seeking likenesses to be cherished by their families, friends, and descendants. Instead, a preponderance of averted eyes and downturned mouths suggests their lack of enthusiasm about being scrutinized and rendered. And Van Gogh, for his part, did not consider these works portraits, but, quote, studies in the literal sense, by which he meant sketches that allowed him to experiment. None was meant to stand alone. Rather, each took its place in a series that Van Gogh called the Peasant Heads. This all-purpose label clearly indicates that he was more interested in the aggregate than its particular components. And rather than focusing on that which distinguished one laborer from the next, Van Gogh stressed commonalities. Removed from the context of their labors, his models are identified as agrarian workers by their lumpy and lopsided features, blunted and weak-chinned profiles, and weather-hardened flesh, all framed by characteristic bonnets, kerchiefs, and caps. In addition, these paintings' muddy palettes and rough textures bespeak life on the land and the literal dirtiness of those who work it. The equation of peasants and soil was a long-standing trope. Jean de la Bruyère, in his Caractère, had described rural laborers as black, drab, scorched by the sun, and bound to the soil they dig. Almost 2 centuries later, critic Théophile Gautier echoed La Bruyère when he described Millet's sower as made of the earth he worked. Van Gogh, an avid reader familiar with them both, doubtless recalled La Bruyère and Gautier when he compared the faces of his Noonan neighbors to, quote, lumps of black earth, and rendered them with grimy hues and rough brushstrokes. In keeping with well-known formulations, Van Gogh asserted in a letter that agrarian workers remind one of the earth and sometimes appear to be made from it. Visual precedents, of course, were equally important to his conception of the peasant, and not surprisingly, Van Gogh acknowledged that he often thought of Millet as he worked on these heads. He described himself as always on the lookout for models with rough, flat faces, low foreheads, and thick lips, full and Millet-like. Thus, while an acquaintance of the time recalled Vincent's penchant for, quote, the ugliest models, the artist's own remarks indicate that he sought out those who conformed to well-established stereotypes and was prepared to tweak and exaggerate as necessary in order to underscore the us-them difference between civilized people and the rural proletariat. Van Gogh's sense of the divide between cultivation and rusticity had been inculcated in his childhood and nurtured by his readings. His favorite author on this topic probably was Scots philosopher Thomas Carlyle, whose Sartor Resartus, a novel of the 1830s, ratified La Bruyère's 17th century insistence on the otherness of peasants, whom Bruyère described as bestial creatures who subsisted on black bread, roots, and water. In Sartor Resartus, which Van Gogh read about a year before he embarked on the Peasant Heads, Carlyle counterposes the effete inhabitants of a fictive European capital with a generic village of laboring folk, whom he calls poor slaves, or, recalling La Bruyère, root eaters. The roots in question were mainly potatoes, which European epicures considered unfit for human consumption. Nonetheless, country folk who could scarcely afford bread, let alone meat, had long cultivated potatoes for their livestock and themselves. Rural folk who had dined on potatoes even in La Bruyère's time did so with increasing regularity in Carlyle's. To brand someone a root eater was to label him animal-like as well as abjectly poor. While Carlyle presents modern urbanites as self-absorbed dandies who are oblivious to the travails of those who produce their food, he takes an equally dim view of the root eaters an ignorant lot whose obsession with their land blinds them to all but their most immediate animal needs. In one scene from the novel, he describes a group of impoverished workers huddled in a dark dwelling before a makeshift table, awaiting, quote, their pot of potatoes. This was a verbal image Van Gogh may well have recalled as he sat in his model's smoke-blackened cottages, and it doubtless inspired his first major painting, which Van Gogh described as a rather large canvas of peasants around a dish of potatoes in the evening. This ambitious multi-figure work was based on drawings made in the company of a particular family, that of Cornelia de Groot. But Van Gogh's decision to title it The Potato Eaters declared his intent to conjure up a whole class, the working poor, rather than to commemorate a particular group of kinfolk. As in his peasant heads, Van Gogh here geared his technique to his subject, since, he said, it would be wrong to give a peasant picture conventional smoothness. If a peasant picture smells of bacon, smoke, and potato steam, all right, that's not unhealthy. To be perfumed is not what a peasant picture needs. The Potato Eaters' indelicate surface not only resulted from Van Gogh's purposeful avoidance of conventional smoothness, but also from the fact that the artist rethought and repainted it. He later recalled that, quote, all the heads were finished, and even finished with great care, but I repainted them, the color of a very dusty potato. While doing this, I thought about how perfect that saying about Millet's peasants is. They look like the earth that they sow. He was eager, quote, to emphasize that these people, eating their potatoes by lamplight, have dug the earth with the very hands they put into the dish, so that the picture speaks of manual labor. As he shipped this decidedly unbeautiful image off to Paris, Van Gogh wrote of his hope that it would open sheltered urbanites' eyes to the realities of farm life. And then he added, I am not anxious for everyone to immediately like or admire it. And it's a good thing because nobody did. But when friends and associates forwarded their comments on the picture's flaws, Van Gogh was quick to note that his supposed mistakes were in fact purposeful manipulations that he himself considered, quote, truer than the literal truth. His deviations from strict accuracy, he wrote, were intended to express personal observations that went beyond surface appearance. His brother Theo, a dealer in Impressionism, was especially distressed by Vincent's increasingly murky palette, which must have struck him as hopelessly old-fashioned. But when he gently suggested that Vincent might try to lighten up, as Parisian painters had, Vincent stubbornly retorted that, in fact, his paintings might get blacker. In the long term, that didn't happen, mainly because Vincent moved to Paris within a year of painting The Potato Eaters. There, over the course of a 2-year stay with Theo, he experienced Impressionism and Post-Impressionism at first hand and gradually warmed to the work of Monet, Seurat, and their colleagues. In response, Van Gogh brightened his palette, lightened his touch, and diversified his brushstroke, but he never gave in fully to either the naturalism of Impressionism or the pseudoscience of Seurat and his acolytes. Van Gogh was more inclined toward expressionism, a tendency he found ratified by his engagement with modern music and its enthusiasts in Paris, where Wagner was all the rage. Ideas promoted in the Revue Wagnerienne, a Parisian journal that was much discussed in artist circles at the time, inspired Van Gogh's ruminations on the notion of musical painting, a phrase he and his contemporaries used to describe a practice in which color and line were freed from strictly representational functions and used instead to elicit emotion in the way Wagner used notes and tempos. While traditionalists held that a painting's meaning resided in its motif, innovators of the 1880s argued that a picture's abstract elements, most especially color, could be equally communicative. The Revue Wagnerienne championed a metaphysical art born of soulful intuition rather than direct observation. Having left North Brabant far behind, Van Gogh pursued civilized pleasures in Paris, attending concerts and exhibitions, discussing art theory with Paul Signac, and drinking in cafes with Toulouse-Lautrec, Émile Bernard, and other young painters. But if peasants, but if peasants were mostly out of sight, they were hardly out of mind. As always, Van Gogh in Paris was an avid reader, and one of the books that most impressed him was Émile Zola's La Terre, a biting portrayal of French farm life that was published in 1887 and much discussed during Van Gogh's second year in Paris. Zola was a crusading muckraker who probed the darkest corners of French society, high and low. His detailed descriptions of graft and corruption, alcoholism and prostitution, murder, sexual assault, domestic violence, and your garden variety vices like lust, greed, and pride were judged offensive by many and controversial by almost everyone. And that's why Van Gogh was a big fan. Zola's Germinal takes up the horrible lives of miners in northern France, and his L'Assommoir details the travails of the Parisian poor. La Terre tread familiar ground in recounting the animality of agrarian workers and their obsession with their land. But Zola, rather than portraying the peasant as exploited, presented him as a conniving and brutal beast whose greed trumps familial bonds and prompts unspeakable violence, and whose pettiness stands in stark contrast to the majesty of his surroundings. As Zola himself put it, quote, "The peasant is a fierce, murderous animal in the midst of the calm, beneficent land." Even in light of Zola's proven record of provocation, La Terre was considered extreme and widely reviled by Parisian literati. The journalist and critic Octave Mirbeau joined a chorus of detractors when he wrote that Zola, quote, "has immeasurably amplified the peasant's faults and vices and unfairly diminished his sublime qualities." Others took Zola to task for his, quote, "monomania of filth, bestial obsession, and unchecked proclivity for degradation and baseness." Van Gogh, by contrast, accepted Zola's characterizations of rustic life and people and ridiculed clueless urbanites who clung to the notion that country folk were gentle, uncomplicated, and guileless. He found Zola's verbal portraits comparable to those he most admired in art, and noted that the author, quote, describes a little old peasant who's exactly like a drawing by Millet. Zola's peasants, like Millet's, became touchstones for Van Gogh and were often on his mind after he moved to Arles, where the rustics he observed, quote, "remind me of figures we see in Zola's work." Much as his horizons had broadened and his work had profited from the time in Paris, Van Gogh ultimately found city life detrimental to his health and psyche. By the end of 1887, describing himself as a borderline alcoholic who felt headed for a stroke, he was eager to retreat to the countryside. But having had his fill of gloomy Dutch winters, he sought a different sort of rusticity. In the hope of finding a bright sun and pellucid atmosphere, he looked southward and settled on Arles, a Rhone River town just 25 miles north of the Mediterranean Sea. Small by comparison to Paris or even The Hague, Arles nonetheless boasted a population of some 23,000 at the time Van Gogh lived there. And though he was somewhat surprised to find it, quote, more dômier than millet, that is, more town and less country than he had imagined, the multiple types he saw on the street intrigued and enticed him. Zouave soldiers, gaudy prostitutes, little girls dressed for church, and a priest Van Gogh described as looking like a dangerous rhinoceros, all seemed to me, he wrote, like creatures from another world. Impressed by their swarthy good looks and struck by their colorful clothing, Van Gogh thought Arlesians cried out to be painted, preferably by someone, quote, who might be to figure painting what Claude Monet is in landscape, a colorist such as never before existed. Perhaps disingenuously, Van Gogh lamented the fact that it probably wouldn't be him, since, in his own estimation, he was neither good-looking nor charming enough to induce models to pose. Though he was able to get this old woman, whose name he never specified, to pose within days of his arrival in Arles, most of the townspeople he approached there rebuffed him, unwilling to be painted even if he paid them. He soon turned his sights on the more millet-like countryside around the town, but he came up empty there as well. The figures in views like this are staffage rather than the sorts of character studies he longed to paint, and Van Gogh complained, "I feel aggrieved because I don't have the power to make those I want to pose for me do it. That's the obstacle. So today I find myself a landscape painter, whereas in reality, figure painting would suit me better." Desperate times called for desperate measures, and 4 months into his stay at Arles, starved for figural work, Van Gogh reverted to a strategy taken up in his first years as an artist, embarking on a peasant picture that, in lieu of a flesh and blood model, took Millet's Sower as its point of departure. Though certainly treading in the footsteps of his illustrious predecessor, Van Gogh was keen on updating Millet's image by way of color. He had come to consider Millet's palette, quote, drab and colorless, and as such, both inappropriate to Provence and out of keeping with modern trends. Van Gogh's experience of Impressionist works in Paris clearly had opened his eyes to the beauties of unadulterated hues. Unlike the Impressionists, however, Van Gogh had little interest in directly transcribing the scene effects of natural light and atmosphere. Indeed, as he told Émile Bernard, "I don't give a damn about the veracity of my colors." He was much more interested in a musical approach that tapped what he called, quote, the symbolic language of color, here setting the cool blues and purples of early morning against the zesty yellow of the rising sun in suggestion of hopeful renewal. Intent on, quote, satisfying our present-day craving for color and reflecting the vibrancy of southern climes, Van Gogh also was eager to touch the viewer's soul by striking what he called the high yellow note that he himself had experienced in Provence. The lushness of its palette and textures makes this Sower very much his own, but Van Gogh continued to be dissatisfied with the disjunction between the transplanted figure and his new surroundings. After several attempts to ground the figure more firmly, Van Gogh gave up. He went ahead and sent the picture to Theo in Paris, but accompanied by the disclaimer that it was, in his eyes, a complete failure. His difficulties with this sower underscored his need of models, and in the summer of 1888, Van Gogh redoubled his efforts to find them. As I've noted, failed negotiations with one promising old man led him to approach a second, Patience Escalier, whom he was delighted to cast as the old peasant. But clearly, given Van Gogh's substitution of one old man for another, the concept for this picture preceded its model. And that concept, peasant with a capital P, had been forged over time, tinged by recollections of La Bruyère and Carlyle, as well as Van Gogh's more recent experience of the fierce brutes who populate La Terre. Millet, of course, had long been Van Gogh's gold standard when it came to peasant painting. And despite his rejection in Provence of Millet's drab palette, Van Gogh continued to believe that Millet had, quote, given us the essence of the peasant, the very thing that he himself aspired to here. Indeed, in announcing this painting's completion to Theo, Vincent wrote, "You will soon make the acquaintance of Mr. Patience Escalier, a kind of man with a hoe," thereby connecting his picture to one of Millet's most notorious works. But whereas Millet, as Van Gogh noted, painted, quote, an entire race and its surroundings, he himself, in The Old Peasant, sought to encapsulate peasantness in a single bust-length figure, a distillation, if you will, of the whole series of peasant heads he'd made at Noonan. The format of The Old Peasant harks back to those Dutch studies, and despite radical stylistic changes that Van Gogh had made in the interim, he wrote of The Old Peasant as, quote, an absolute continuation of the peasant heads made in North Brabant almost 4 years earlier. And he expected that Parisian sophisticates would respond to this new painting in much the same way they'd reacted to the potato eaters, because, as there, Van Gogh had tweaked what he saw to produce something decidedly quirky and unpretty. As he told it, quote, the color of this peasant picture is not so black as in the potato eaters, but the civilized Parisian is going to find himself confronted by the same old problem. That problem was shocking unconventionality, born of rude brushwork and of the jarring colors that were expressive rather than naturalistic. As Van Gogh told Theo, what I learned in Paris is fading, and I'm returning to ideas I had in the country before I knew the Impressionists. Because instead of trying to render exactly what I have before my eyes, I use color arbitrarily to express myself forcibly. In other words, Van Gogh at Arles rejected what he perceived as the Impressionists' insistent naturalism, and, as at Noonan, he tempered what he saw to produce something truer than the literal truth. Whereas the muddiness of the potato eaters was calculated to reflect the drab earthiness of Noonan laborers, the brash hues of The Old Peasant were intended, Van Gogh wrote, to convey, quote, the scorched air of harvest time and blistering heat. Thus he wrote, he used orange hues, flashing like lightning, vivid as red-hot iron, and luminous tones of old gold, even in the shadows. What's more, he accentuated the heat of those oranges and golds by offsetting them with cool blues and greens. In the peasant's sunburned face, the blue-green of his smock is picked up in his beard, his brows, his flesh, and even the whites of his eyes. Van Gogh was convinced that his painting's exaggeratedly bold palette and choppy surface would strike some viewers as ugly, and he predicted that, quote, proper folks will see the exaggeration as caricature. But, he added, what do we care? We've read La Terre and Germinal, and if we're painting a peasant, we want to show that our reading has somehow become part of us. In invoking Zola, Van Gogh was attaching his project to controversial portrayals of working folk that many cultivated people had judged excessive and even repulsive. Like Zola, Van Gogh sought to convey the ferocity of those who scraped their living out of the soil, and he lamented that his target audience, Parisian art lovers, lacked, quote, a taste for crude things. He attributed the dearth of real peasant pictures in Paris to the squeamishness of those he branded proper folk. He was well aware that the middle-brow masses preferred the work of salon favorites like Bouguereau and Jules Breton. Their pictures' soft colors, poetic light, and subtle brushwork, staples of the most popular treatments of peasant life, were abhorrent to Van Gogh, and better suited, he thought, to chocolate boxes than serious painting. Whereas Bouguereau and Breton show peasants in the context of their labors, and Breton's actually work, Van Gogh was more interested in the cumulative effect of the laboring life, as inscribed on his model's face and reflected in his eyes. As in the heads Van Gogh made at Noonan, the old peasant is marked as such not by his labors, but by distinctive headgear and clothing, weather-beaten flesh, and the purposeful lack of refinement in the artist's brushwork and palette. And while both Bouguereau and Breton focus on compliant women, the traditional handmaidens of nature, Van Gogh's in-your-face peasant picture focuses on a fierce-looking man whom the artist compared to a wild beast. Like in animals, Escalier's gaze is keen but watchful, on the verge of skittering off to one side. His upper lip curls slightly on one side to reveal the glint of a tooth, and one shoulder twists forward as if poised to muscle its way out of the picture and into our space. His Patience Escalier is an edgy guy, very much in the mode of Zola's rather ferocious farmers. Pleased with the vivacity of the old peasant, Van Gogh sent it off to Paris with the suggestion that Theo try hanging it next to a figural piece by Toulouse-Lautrec, a picture the Van Gogh brothers had acquired during Vincent's time in Paris. Titled Poudre de Riz, a reference to the powder contained in the red jar on the table, Lautrec's painting is, like the old peasant, a portrait-like work that's not a portrait per se. Its unnamed model embodies a type, the demi-mondaine, and personifies the cityfied glamour and decadence that Van Gogh considered the old peasant's opposites. In addition to their most obvious differences of gender and age, Lautrec's model is as pallid as Escalier is tawny, slight while he is bulky, and distanced from the viewer by a tabletop, whereas he is seen close up. Although her flimsy chemise and open powder jar suggest an interrupted toilette, the model's forward-leaning posture and imperious gaze indicate she's hardly discomfited by our intrusion. Her bold demeanor stands in marked contrast to the muted palette and delicate touch with which Lautrec painted her. As Vincent mentally compared Lautrec's work with his own, he predicted that the old peasant would, quote, profit by this odd juxtaposition, since its sun-steeped, sunburnt, air-swept quality would be effectively offset by all that face powder and elegance. Whereas his picture called up the robust ferocity of the countryside, Lautrec's captured the refined artifice of Paris, a place where, in Van Gogh's estimation, nothing is fresh. Among art historians, Van Gogh's Old Peasant is more apt to be projected alongside this painting, a reprise of the subject that bears the same title. As I've mentioned, Van Gogh had initially balked at painting a second version of the Old Peasant when its first potential model had asked for a picture to keep. Yet, for reasons he did not articulate, Van Gogh decided to return to the subject within a couple weeks of completing his first Old Peasant. We know that he brought Escalier back to the studio and paid him anew to pose. Even so, it seems to me that this later work lacks the raw immediacy of its predecessor. The redo seems more considered and mediated, as much a product of the artist's mind's eye as of the model's physical presence. Its palette is simplified and intentionally emblematic. Van Gogh noted that, quote, the bright orange backdrop, although it doesn't pretend to literally represent a red sunset, still gives the suggestion of one. Moreover, the combination of orange and blue was one Van Gogh had long associated with peasants. As a rule, he wrote, peasants' figures are blue, the most beautiful blue I've ever seen, faded but blue enough to react to all those colors in which orange elements can be found. In this second version, the Old Peasant seems more removed, both physically and emotionally, than his predecessor. Though his head projects outward, his shoulders recede a bit and are fully contained by the frame. His hands and stick hold him somewhat at bay, and his vacant stare suggests his mind is elsewhere. This distancing, along with the model's settled stasis, makes the second Old Peasant seem less aggressive than the first, as does the artist's somewhat becalmed brushwork. The enhanced placidity of the second portrait gives Escalier a more aged aspect, as do the revelation of white hair at his temples and overrunning his brows, and his apparent reliance on a walking stick to keep him upright. Though Van Gogh invoked Millet's Man with a Hoe in reference to the first Old Peasant rather than the second, that picture clearly stayed with him as he revisited the subject. He surely had Millet's famed figure in mind when he posed Escalier leaning with gnarled hands onto a wooden support, albeit a stick rather than a hoe. Although Escalier looks considerably older and much less vexed than Millet's burned-out worker, similarities of posture, prop, and gesture seem way too close to be coincidental. On a more speculative note, I would suggest that the change from hoe to walking stick and from younger man to older might be attributed to memories of Zola's La Terre, which paints a vivid portrait of a done-down old peasant named Fouan, whom Jules Charest foregrounded in his poster for the book. Zola's Fouan is a one-time paterfamilias who has foolishly ceded his farmland to his adult children while still alive. In so doing, he's made himself superfluous in their eyes, and as his story unfolds, Fouan is disrespectfully handed off from one to the next as each becomes tired of caring for him. In the face of his children's disregard, Fouan retreats into his own thoughts in long hours spent alone. As Zola writes, quote, he was constantly going to look at his former fields, like a man obsessed with a one-time mistress. The old man would stand for hours before a field propped up on his stick, then hobble along to another and start daydreaming again, like a dried-up old tree by the roadside. Often he would sit like that for a whole afternoon, stock still, as if in a stupor, staring blankly. People would go by without even greeting him because he was turning into a mere thing. Zola describes him as stooped, haggard, and on the brink of, quote, toppling into his grave, a, quote, decaying human wreck within which, quote, only the animal still survived, obstinately clinging to life. While Van Gogh certainly had both Millet's and Zola's peasant portrayals generally in mind when he crafted the first Old Peasant, his reworking of the subject in this second version seems more directly linked to their vivid and specific portrayals of beleaguered farmers. Millet's Man with a Hoe, from whom Van Gogh adapted the pose, and Zola's Poor Old Fouan, whose pathos seems to color Van Gogh's second take on his own Old Peasant. While the clashing colors of the first Old Peasant were meant to convey the blistering heat of fields scorched by the midday sun, Van Gogh noted that the, quote, sunset radiance of the second version might, quote, suggest the eagerness of a soul. This coloristic allusion to day's end implies the closeness of death, especially in conjunction with explicit markers of old age, the peasant's bleary gaze, graying brows, and round-shouldered hunch over his stick. The transformation of model and mood from one version to the next shows Van Gogh's growing inclination toward imaginative invention in his figural work at Arles. I don't try for photographic resemblance, he acknowledged, but for passionate expression. Rejecting the momentary and particular, Van Gogh was in search of something timeless, a quality he described as, quote, that something of the eternal which a halo used to symbolize and which we seek to convey by the radiance and vibration of color. Both these paintings are amalgams in which such conceptual thinking mingled with lived experience, ingrained beliefs, recollections of pictures and books, and, of course, the fabulous face of Patience Escalier, which we have the rare opportunity of going out and looking at right now. So get out there and go nose to nose with him. Thank you.